She was 12 years old when she looked him in the eyes and said those words, "Someday I'll be your wife."
Tenha fé.
The frontier preacher smiled gently, the way adults do when children make promises they don't understand.
Essa foi ótima.
He told her the world changes people, that childhood promises don't count. She disagreed with the quiet certainty of someone who could see further than he could. 13 years later, on a windswept afternoon, in a dying town that had forgotten how to hope, she would ride back into his life and prove that some promises are made by the soul, not the age. This is the story of what happened when destiny decided to collect on a debt neither of them knew they owed, and how a single moment of childhood clarity became the anchor point for two lives that were always meant to intersect. Red Hollow existed in that peculiar space between memory and extinction, the kind of place that held on not through prosperity, but through sheer stubborn refusal to admit defeat. It sat in a valley where the earth was more dust than soil, where the sun beat down with personal malice, where the wind carried grit that got into your teeth and eyes and lungs until you tasted the desert with every breath. Half a dozen buildings scattered along what optimistic people called Main Street, though it was really just a wide path between structures that looked like they were always one strong wind away from collapse. There was a saloon called the Dusty Rose, though there was nothing rosy about it, just dark wood and darker memories, and the smell of whiskey and regret. A general store that sold more credit than goods. A livery stable run by a man named Dutch who had maybe 3 teeth left, and stories about the Mexican War that got more elaborate every time he told them. A boarding house where the rooms cost too much and the beds had bugs. And at the far end of the street, standing slightly apart like it wasn't quite sure it belonged, a small wooden church that creaked and groaned in the wind like it was having a conversation with God that nobody else was invited to hear. The town had been born around a water well that prospectors had dug on their way to somewhere more promising. They'd hit water, good water, cold and clear, and decided this was as good a place as any to stop being failures. They built the well deeper, put up buildings, started calling it Red Hollow because the earth in the valley had a reddish tint when the sun hit it right, like old blood mixed with sand. For a few years, it looked like Red Hollow might actually become something. More people came. There was talk of bringing the railroad through, but the railroad went north instead, following better water and flatter land. And Red Hollow was left behind, like a woman at a dance nobody asks to partner with. People started leaving. First the ambitious ones, then the smart ones, then anyone who had somewhere else to go. What remained were the stubborn, the broke, the hiding, and the resigned. The ones who had given up on better and settled for breathing. That's where Elias Crow arrived on a Tuesday morning when even the lizards were looking for shade. He came on foot, carrying everything he owned in a canvas bag slung over one shoulder and a Bible under his arm like it was both weapon and shield. He was 31 years old, but looked older in the eyes. The way men do when they've seen things they wish they could unsee. Tall, lean, with shoulders that had done hard work and hands that bore the calluses to prove it. Dark hair starting to show threads of grey at the temples. A face that might have been handsome if it ever relaxed, but mostly it held an expression somewhere between determination and penance, like he was working off a debt to someone who'd never quite specified the terms. He wasn't the kind of preacher Red Hollow expected, if they'd expected one at all. No white hair, no trembling hands, no voice that sounded like it had been worn smooth by decades of prayer and disappointment. He was young enough to still believe words mattered, and old enough to know they usually didn't. He had been sent by the Territorial Church Council, which was a fancy name for 3 men in Santa Fe who decided where preachers went based on a combination of need, punishment, and availability. Red Hollow had requested a preacher twice in the past 5 years. Both times none had come. This time Elias volunteered. The council members had looked at each other with the expression of men who just watched someone volunteer to be shot. but they'd given him the assignment and wished him luck in tones that suggested they didn't expect to see him again. The church itself was a modest structure, generous language for what was essentially 4 walls and a roof with pretensions of holiness. The pews were rough-hewn benches that gave splinters if you sat wrong. The altar was a table someone had donated after it became too wobbly for eating. There were no stained glass windows, just openings with shutters that never quite closed all the way, letting in dust and light in equal measure. The floor was bare wood that had absorbed so much dust it had turned the color of the desert itself. At the front, nailed to the wall behind the altar, hung a simple wooden cross that looked like it had been carved with more enthusiasm than skill. The previous preacher, a man named Horace, who'd lasted exactly 4 months before fleeing back east, had left behind exactly 3 things: the cross, a note of apology, and a bottle of whiskey hidden under the pulpit that was half empty. Elias found the whiskey his first day. He stood there holding it, feeling its weight, understanding the temptation. Then he poured it out on the ground outside the church, watching it sink into the dust like an offering or a baptism. He didn't judge Horace. Understood him, actually. This place could drive a man to drink or prayer or madness, and sometimes all 3 were the same thing. The town watched him with the suspicion reserved for anything new. Too young, they whispered in the saloon. Too educated for this God-forsaken end of the world. And quiet. Way too quiet for a preacher. Where were the hallelujahs? Where was the fire and brimstone? Where was the performance? Elias didn't perform. He spoke quietly, almost conversationally, like he was having a discussion with God that the congregation was allowed to overhear. He read from Scripture without dramatics, let the words stand on their own, trusted that they meant something or they didn't. He never raised his voice, never pounded the pulpit, never worked himself into the kind of frenzied enthusiasm that people associated with genuine faith. This made them nervous, made them wonder what he was hiding. A man that calm had to be running from something, they reasoned, had to have secrets. The kind of secrets that made a young preacher volunteer for a dying town in the middle of nowhere when he could have had a nice position somewhere civilized, somewhere with actual people and actual hope. They were right, of course. He was running, but not from what they imagined. The first Sunday, 7 people showed up. By the 3rd Sunday, it was down to 5. By the 5th, just 3. Elias preached to them anyway, with the same attention and care he would have given to a full house. He talked about grace, about second chances, about how God didn't give up on places just because they were dying, about how faith wasn't about being perfect, but about getting back up after you fell, about how redemption was always available if you were willing to reach for it. The words hung in the dusty air of the church and settled on the empty pews like they were meant for congregations that weren't there yet. Among the sparse and dwindling attendees, there was one constant presence. One pair of eyes that never missed a Sunday, that watched him with an intensity that was almost uncomfortable in someone so young. Clara Mayfield, 12 years old and already acquainted with the specific brand of loneliness that comes from losing people before you understand why losing them matters. She was thin, all sharp angles and 2 big eyes, with hair the color of dried wheat that she tied back with whatever she could find, string, strips of cloth, once even a piece of rawhide she'd found in the street. Her dresses were hand-me-downs from hand-me-downs, faded calico that had been patched so many times it was hard to say what the original fabric had looked like. Her shoes, when she wore them, were too big, stuffed with newspaper to make them fit. She lived with her mother, Margaret Mayfield, in a cabin on the eastern edge of town, the kind of structure that was one storm away from being kindling. Margaret was a woman who'd been broken by the West in the way water breaks rock, slowly and completely. Her husband, Clara's father, had joined a wagon train heading to California 7 years earlier, promising to send for them once he'd made his fortune. They'd never heard from him again. Dead, probably. Or maybe he'd found a new life and a new family and decided the old ones weren't worth the postage. Either way, gone. Margaret had tried to keep going, taking in washing and mending, but the work was scarce and the pay was worse, and slowly she'd faded into a kind of ghostly existence. Present but not really there, going through the motions of living without the substance of life. Clara had learned early that she couldn't depend on anyone. That survival meant being smarter, tougher, more observant than the world expected a child to be. She'd learned to read from a battered primer someone had left behind, sounding out words by candlelight while her mother slept or stared at nothing. She could calculate odds better than most gamblers from watching the men play cards through the saloon windows. She could tell when a storm was coming by the smell of the air and the behavior of the birds. She could stretch a handful of beans into 3 days of meals. She knew which plants in the desert were edible and which would kill you. She was 12 years old and already understood that the world didn't owe her anything, that kindness was rare and usually had a price, that hope was something you had to manufacture yourself because nobody else was going to give it to you. And then Elias Crow walked into Red Hollow, and something in her recognized something in him. She started coming to church not because of faith. She wasn't sure she believed in God. Not really. Not after watching her mother pray for 7 years and get nothing but silence. But because the church was quiet. Because Elias never told her to leave. Never treated her like she was in the way. Never asked her questions she didn't want to answer. She would slip in before the service started and sit in the back row, in the corner where the light didn't quite reach, and listen. Not to the words exactly, to the way he said them, to the calm certainty in his voice, like he knew something the rest of the world didn't, like he'd found an answer to a question she didn't know how to ask. While the adults whispered and judged and left early, Clara stayed, every single time. She would wait until everyone else had gone, until the dust they'd kicked up on the way out had settled, and then sometimes she'd approach him with questions. Not the kind of questions children usually asked. Not "Can I have candy or will you tell my mother I was good?" But real questions, hard questions. Why does God let bad things happen? If faith is supposed to help, why are people here so miserable? Do you think my father is dead or just gone? Do you think there's a difference? Elias answered honestly, never talked down to her, never gave her the easy answers. Sometimes he said, "I don't know," which she appreciated, because it meant he respected her enough to tell the truth. Other times, he'd sit on the edge of the altar and think before speaking, treating her questions with the seriousness they deserved. He told her that faith wasn't about having all the answers, it was about learning to live with the questions. That God wasn't a magic solution but a presence, if you were willing to feel it. That her father's choices were his own and had nothing to do with her worth. That sometimes the world was cruel for no reason at all, and all you could do was decide what kind of person you wanted to be in response to that cruelty. She absorbed these conversations like parched earth absorbs rain, stored them away, used them to build something inside herself that felt like a foundation. One afternoon in late autumn, after the service had ended and the handful of attendees had shuffled back out into the harsh sunlight, Clara approached him as he was closing the Bible. She'd been quieter than usual that day, more withdrawn, like she was turning something over in her mind. He'd noticed but hadn't pushed, had learned that Clara would speak when she was ready and not before. She stood in front of him, small and serious, her hands clasped in front of her like she was about to make an important announcement. Her eyes, which were too old for her face, held his without wavering. "You gonna leave like the others did?" she asked. Not accusatory, just factual, just needing to know. Elias set the Bible down gently. The question wasn't unexpected. Every adult who'd shown her kindness had eventually left. Her father, the previous preacher, the school teacher who'd tried to start a school and given up after 3 months. Even her mother was leaving in a different way, retreating further into herself every day until soon there might be nothing left at all. Clara was preparing herself for another abandonment, building the walls before they were needed. He recognized it because he'd done the same thing once. "I don't plan to," he said simply. Didn't make promises he couldn't keep. Didn't offer false reassurance. Just stated his intention and let it stand. She studied his face for a long moment, looking for the lie, the hesitation, the crack that would reveal this was temporary. She didn't find it. Something in her posture relaxed, just slightly, like a breath she'd been holding finally released, and then she said it with the matter-of-fact tone of someone stating an obvious truth, like 2 + 2 = 4, or the sun rises in the east. Then someday I'm gonna be your wife. The church seemed to hold its breath. Outside the wind stopped. Even the dust motes, hanging in the shafts of light through the windows, seemed to pause mid-fall. Elias felt the words land in the space between them like stones dropped in still water, creating ripples he couldn't quite track. He didn't laugh, didn't dismiss her, didn't do what most adults would do, which was pat her head and tell her that was cute. Because it wasn't cute. It was something else entirely. It was a child looking at the future and declaring a destination, and there was something almost frightening in the certainty of it. He crouched down slowly until they were eye to eye, until he could see his reflection in her too serious gaze. When he spoke, his voice was gentle but firm, the way you'd speak to someone standing at the edge of a cliff who didn't realize how far the drop was. "You've got a long road ahead of you, Clara," he said. "The world changes people, changes what they want, changes who they are." She considered this without flinching. "You don't seem to change," she observed. He almost smiled at that, almost, because she was wrong but didn't know it yet. He'd changed more than most people change in a lifetime, had become someone different, someone he was still learning to live with. But to her, he probably seemed solid, permanent, like bedrock. "One day you'll understand that promises made by children aren't really promises," he told her. "They're just wishes, and wishes don't have to come true to matter." Clara frowned, and he could see the disagreement forming behind her eyes. She wanted to argue, wanted to tell him he was wrong, but she didn't have the words yet, didn't have the experience to back up what she felt, which was that some things you know before you understand them. Some truths exist before you have the language to express them. "Even still," she said finally. Her voice was quiet but absolute. "Someday." And then she turned and ran out of the church, her 2 big shoes making scuffing sounds on the wooden floor, leaving him alone with the echo of a promise that shouldn't have mattered, but somehow did. In the months that followed, Clara kept coming to church, kept asking questions, kept existing in the periphery of his life in a way that felt both natural and strange. She never mentioned the promise again, treated it like it was simply a fact that had been established and required no further discussion. Elias tried not to think about it, tried to focus on his work, on the sermons that fewer and fewer people heard, on the repairs the church always needed, on the pastoral care that mostly consisted of sitting with the dying and burying the dead. Red Hollow was dying too, slowly bleeding population and hope. The well was starting to give less water, the general store was running on credit that would never be repaid. The saloon was full every night but quiet. Men drinking in silence, mourning losses they couldn't articulate. More buildings stood empty than occupied. Tumbleweeds collected in the spaces between structures like the desert itself was trying to reclaim the town, erase the presumption of human habitation. When winter came, it came hard. The kind of cold that got into your bones and wouldn't leave, that made breathing hurt and movement slow. The wind blew down from the north with a vindictiveness that felt personal, like it was angry at anyone presumptuous enough to still be alive. People huddled in their homes, burning what fuel they had, wearing every layer they owned, waiting for spring like prisoners waiting for parole. Margaret Mayfield got sick in December. Started as a cough, the kind that rattled in the chest and wouldn't break. Clara tried everything she knew. Hot water with honey, mustard plasters, extra blankets, prayer. Even though she didn't believe in it, nothing helped. The cough got worse, became wet, then bloody. Margaret spent her days in bed, shivering under quilts that weren't enough, staring at the ceiling or at nothing, occasionally whispering words Clara couldn't quite hear. Elias found out through Dutch at the livery, who'd heard it from someone else. The way news travelled in small towns carried on whispers and concern and the particular excitement people feel when tragedy visits someone else's house. He walked to the Mayfield cabin that afternoon, carrying firewood and what food he could spare, and his Bible, though he suspected the wood and food would be more useful than prayers. The cabin was worse than he'd imagined. Gaps in the walls where the wind came through, a roof that leaked, a stove that barely worked. Clara answered his knock, and he saw in her face that she hadn't slept in days. She let him in without a word, too exhausted for pride. He stayed for hours, split more wood, fixed the stove as best he could, made soup from the supplies he'd brought and some potatoes Clara had, sat by Margaret's bedside while Clara slept in a chair, her head tilted at an angle that would make her neck hurt when she woke. He read scripture quietly. Not for Margaret. She was too far gone to hear, but because the words were familiar. And familiar things mattered when everything else was falling apart. Margaret died 3 days later, on a morning when the frost was so thick it looked like the world had been painted white. Clara was holding her hand when it happened, had been holding it for hours, as if her grip alone could keep her mother tethered to life. But bodies know when it's time to stop fighting, and Margaret's body had known for a while. She stopped breathing between one moment and the next, no dramatic final words, no meaningful looks, just the absence of breath where breath had been. Clara didn't cry, just sat there holding a hand that was already getting cold, staring at a face that looked more peaceful than it had in years. Elias was there, had stayed the night keeping vigil, and he saw in Clara's dry eyes something that worried him. Not grief. Grief would come later if it came at all. This was something colder, harder, the look of someone deciding they were done losing things. He buried Margaret in the cemetery behind the church. The ground was frozen, made digging brutal work that took most of a day. His hands bled through his gloves, his shoulders burned, but he kept digging because that's what you did. You put the dead in the ground and said words over them and hoped it meant something. A handful of people showed up for the service. Dutch, a woman named Mary who'd been Margaret's occasional employer, a few others who came out of obligation or curiosity. Clara stood silent through all of it, her face expressionless, her hands still. After the burial, after everyone else had left, Clara stood at the grave for a long time. Elias waited at a respectful distance, ready to offer comfort if she wanted it, prepared to give space if she didn't. Finally she turned and walked toward him. Her eyes were still dry. Her voice was still steady. "They're sending me away," she said. "No preamble, just fact. The church council arranged it. I have relatives in Wyoming Territory. They've agreed to take me." "When?" he asked. "Day after tomorrow. There's a family heading that direction. I'll travel with them." He felt something tighten in his chest, something he couldn't name and shouldn't feel. "Do you want to go?" he asked. She shrugged. "Doesn't matter what I want," she said. "Can't stay here alone. And even if I could, there's nothing left here anyway." She was probably right, but that didn't make it easier. "I'll write," she said, then paused. "If that's allowed, if you'd want me to." "I'd like that," he told her, and meant it. She nodded once, sharp and final. Then she looked at him with those two old eyes and said something that sounded like goodbye, but felt like something else. "Don't forget," she said. "I won't," he promised, though he wasn't entirely sure what he was promising to remember. 2 days later, she was gone. Left before dawn with a family he'd never met, heading to a place he'd never been, to live with people who were strangers connected only by blood. He watched the wagon roll out of town from the steps of the church, watched until it disappeared into the dust and distance, and felt like something important had ended before it had a chance to begin. The years after Clara left were hard in ways that had nothing to do with physical hardship and everything to do with purpose. Elias continued his work, preached to smaller and smaller congregations, maintained the church, buried the dead, and there were many of them as Red Hollow continued its slow spiral into extinction. He married a few couples, baptized fewer children, counseled people through problems that rarely had solutions. He became part of the landscape, as permanent and unremarkable as the mountains in the distance. He never received a letter from Clara. After the first year, he stopped expecting one. She'd moved on, built a new life, forgotten the promise that had never been a real promise anyway. This was natural. This was good. Children grew up and became different people, and that was exactly what should happen. But he didn't forget her. Found himself sometimes wondering how she was doing, if she was happy, if her relatives treated her well, if she'd found whatever it was she'd been looking for when she looked at him and saw a future. He told himself these thoughts were pastoral concern, the natural interest a minister took in former congregants. Told himself they meant nothing more than that. The town continued dying. The saloon finally closed when the owner drank himself into an early grave, and nobody wanted to take over the business. The general store hung on, but barely, more out of stubbornness than profit. More houses stood empty, more families left. The well started giving up more dust than water, and talk began about abandoning Red Hollow entirely, letting the desert have it back, admitting that trying to build something here had always been folly. Elias stayed. People asked why. He never had a good answer. Partly it was stubbornness, partly it was penance. He was still working off debts he never talked about. Sins that required payment in service and solitude. Partly it was simply that leaving would require deciding where to go, and he had nowhere else that felt more like home than this dying place that had never really welcomed him. He got older. His hair went grey, then white. His hands developed calluses on top of calluses. His face became lined with years and sun, and the particular weariness that comes from bearing witness to suffering you can't prevent. He became less of a preacher and more of a general fix-it man, someone who could repair roofs and deliver babies and sit with the dying and bury them after. The collar he wore started to feel less like an identity and more like a costume, something he put on because it was expected, not because it meant what it once had. Before we continue, I'm really curious. Where are you watching this from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. I love seeing how far these stories reach. And if you're finding value in this story, please hit that subscribe button. It really helps me keep sharing these experiences with all of you. 15 years passed, like water through cupped hands, inevitable and faster than seemed possible. 15 years of sameness and slow erosion, of seasons that blurred together, of days that meant nothing and nights that meant less. 15 years of forgetting who he'd been and becoming someone he didn't particularly like but was learning to tolerate. 15 years of silence where Clara's name was never spoken, where that moment in the church became just another memory filed away with all the others, gathering dust. And then one hot afternoon, when even the shadows were sweating, when the air shimmered with heat, and the town lay quiet in that dead hour after lunch, a horse and rider appeared on the eastern road. Elias was inside the church, attempting to fix a leak in the roof with materials that were barely adequate, when he heard hoofbeats. Visitors were rare enough to be noteworthy, so he climbed down from the ladder and walked outside, squinting against the brutal sunlight. The woman who dismounted was not what he expected. She wore practical traveling clothes, worn but well-maintained, dark pants instead of a skirt, A shirt with the sleeves rolled up, boots that had seen serious miles, a hat with a wide brim that cast her face in shadow. She moved with an economy of motion that spoke of competence, of someone used to taking care of herself. When she removed the hat and looked at him directly, he felt the ground shift. "Good afternoon, preacher," she said. Her voice was low, controlled, with an edge underneath like steel wrapped in velvet. He stared, that voice, those eyes, the shape of her face, impossible. But there it was. "Clara," he breathed, more question than statement. She nodded once, sharp and certain. "I came back." His mind couldn't quite process it. The girl he remembered, thin and desperate and 12 years old, stood before him as a woman. She'd grown tall, though still lean, with the kind of strength that comes from necessity rather than leisure. Her face had lost its childish roundness, become angular and defined, weathered by experience. Her hair was longer, tied back in a practical braid. Her hands, he noticed, were calloused but not rough, capable hands that knew work. But her eyes, those hadn't changed. Still too old, still seeing more than they should. "You?" he started, then stopped. Couldn't form the question, couldn't figure out which of the 100 questions in his head to ask first. "Can we talk?" she asked. "Inside, maybe. I've been riding for 3 days and would appreciate some shade." He nodded, moved aside to let her pass, still not quite believing she was real. She tied her horse to the post outside the church, removed saddlebags that looked heavy, and followed him into the dim interior. The church hadn't changed much. Still the same rough benches, the same struggling altar, the same wooden cross on the wall. She looked around like she was confirming a memory, making sure it matched what she'd carried in her head. They sat on one of the benches, not in the front where formality would have placed them, but near the back where she'd always sat as a child. The air between them felt heavy, filled with years and unasked questions, and the ghost of a promise nobody was sure how to address. "How have you been?" he asked. Inadequate question, stupid question, but it was a place to start. Clara smiled, but there was no humor in it. "Surviving," she said. "Isn't that what we all do?" She told her story slowly, carefully, like she was rationing out pieces of herself and needed to make them last. The relatives in Wyoming territory had taken her in, but only barely. They'd needed hands for work more than they'd wanted a child. She'd been given a corner of the barn to sleep in, food that was adequate but never generous, and work that started before dawn and ended after dark. Farming, milking, collecting eggs, mending fences, slaughtering chickens, everything that needed doing on a hard-scrabble ranch that was one bad season away from failure. She'd endured it because enduring was what you did, because she had nowhere else to go, because 13-year-old girls didn't have choices, they had circumstances. But she'd also learned that survival required making yourself valuable, required being smarter than the people who held power over you, required patience and planning and the willingness to wait for opportunity. When she was 16, a man named Thomas Garrett started coming around. He was 43, owned a dry goods business in the nearest town, and had recently lost his second wife to fever. He wanted a new one, someone young who could give him children and keep his house and not ask inconvenient questions. Her relatives saw an opportunity, started encouraging the courtship, started talking about how lucky Clara was, how generous Thomas was, how this was the best she could hope for. She'd met with Thomas 3 times, sat in the parlor while he talked about his business and his plans and his expectations. He never asked about her, never inquired about her thoughts or desires or dreams. She was a solution to a problem, not a person. On the 3rd visit, when her uncle started talking about setting a date, Clara excused herself to use the outhouse. She walked out the back door instead, took a horse that wasn't hers, rode for 2 days to the nearest town with a telegraph office, sent a message to a church organization she'd heard of, asked for help, got work as a housekeeper for a minister's family in Santa Fe. It wasn't freedom, exactly, but it was better. The minister's wife was kind, if distant. The children were manageable. Clara had her own small room and regular meals and time to herself in the evenings. She taught herself to read better, devouring every book in the house, learned arithmetic, learned how to write properly, saved every penny she could. When she was 19, another proposal, this time from the minister's nephew, a young man studying law who seemed kind at first. They courted properly, with supervision and social expectations. He talked about their future together, about the home they'd build, about the life they'd share. She almost believed it, almost let herself imagine a different kind of existence. Then one evening he came to visit slightly drunk and tried to kiss her forcefully, got angry when she pushed him away, called her ungrateful and worse things. She ended it immediately. He tried to ruin her reputation in response, spread lies about her morality and character. She had to leave Santa Fe entirely. She went to Albuquerque, found work in a hotel. It was grueling work, making beds, scrubbing floors, emptying chamber pots, dealing with drunk guests and inappropriate propositions, and the constant exhaustion that came from never sitting down. But she was good at it. Got promoted to head housekeeper within 2 years, earned enough to rent a room of her own, started building something that felt almost like stability, and then, 6 months ago, everything changed. A group of businessmen stayed at the hotel, wealthy men from back east, talking loudly about land deals and opportunities and the fortunes to be made in the territories. Clara, invisible in the way servants are invisible, overheard conversations she wasn't supposed to hear, about fraudulent land claims, about documents being forged, about families being driven off property they'd worked for generations, so these men could sell it to the railroad at enormous profit. She'd seen the papers one afternoon while cleaning their room. Contracts with signatures that looked freshly forged, maps with claims that didn't match official territory records, evidence of a scheme that would displace hundreds of families and funnel wealth to a handful of already wealthy men. She'd spent her entire life watching powerful people exploit those with less power. Something in her snapped. She took the documents. Not all of them. That would have been noticed immediately. But enough. Enough to prove what was happening. Enough to matter. She'd run. Of course she had. What else could she do? She'd taken the evidence and a horse that wasn't technically hers, but whose owner owed her back wages anyway. And she'd ridden hard, staying ahead of the men she knew would come looking. She couldn't go to authorities. These men were the authorities, or owned them. She couldn't stay in Albuquerque. Too easy to find. She'd needed somewhere remote, somewhere forgettable, somewhere she could think and plan and figure out what to do with evidence that could destroy powerful men, but might also get her killed. And so she'd thought of Red Hollow, of the preacher who'd never lied to her, who'd buried her mother and asked nothing in return, who'd told her the truth even when it wasn't kind, who'd been the closest thing to safety she'd ever known. She told Elias all of this in a voice that never wavered, never asked for sympathy, simply stated facts the way you'd report the weather. When she finished, the church was darker. Time had passed without either of them noticing. The sun was lower, casting long shadows through the windows. "I'm sorry," Elias said finally. Inadequate words, but what else was there? "Don't be," Clara replied. "I made my choices. I'm not asking for rescue, just—" She hesitated, then continued, "I needed somewhere to breathe, to figure out what comes next, and I remembered this place, remembered you." "How long?" he asked. "I don't know," she admitted. "The men looking for me are relentless, but also cautious. They don't want public attention. If I stay hidden long enough, maybe they'll decide the risk isn't worth it. Maybe they'll cut their losses, or maybe—" She smiled without humor. "Maybe they'll find me and I'll have bigger problems to worry about." "You can stay," he said immediately. "The church has a small room in the back. It's not much, but it's private. And Red Hollow, well, nobody comes here who doesn't have to. You'd be as hidden as anywhere." She looked at him then, really looked at him, and he saw something in her expression he couldn't quite read. "Thank you," she said softly. That night, Clara stayed in the small room behind the church that had been used for storage. Elias cleared it out as best he could, brought a cot and blankets, made it as comfortable as possible given the circumstances. She accepted without fuss, without pretending she didn't need the help. They said goodnight with a formality that felt strange given everything they'd shared, everything that hung unspoken between them. Elias lay awake in his own small quarters attached to the church, listening to the wind and thinking about the girl who'd become a woman, the promise that had seemed so innocent and impossible, the way fate worked in circles instead of lines. The next few days passed in a strange limbo. Clara helped around the church without being asked, swept floors that didn't really need sweeping, organized supplies that didn't really need organizing, kept herself busy in the way people do when stillness feels dangerous. She didn't go into town, stayed out of sight, though Red Hollow was so quiet and so focused on its own slow death that nobody would have noticed anyway. Elias continued his routine: morning prayers, repairs that never ended, visits to the sick. But everything felt different now, charged with an awareness that hadn't existed before. He found himself acutely conscious of her presence, the sound of her moving around, the smell of coffee she'd made, the sight of her reading one of his books in the evening light. They talked, carefully at first, then with increasing ease, about books they'd read, about philosophy and faith and doubt, about the West and its cruelty and its strange beauty, about people they'd known and places they'd been. They discovered they shared a dry sense of humor, a tendency toward honesty that others found uncomfortable, a bone-deep stubbornness about things that mattered. They argued about theology. She was skeptical where he was faithful, practical where he was idealistic. But the arguments felt like discovery rather than conflict. One evening, sitting on the church steps watching the sun turn the desert red and gold, Clara asked the question he'd been expecting. "Do you remember," she said, "what I told you when I was 12? He was quiet for a moment. "Yes," he said finally. "I remember." "Did you think I was foolish?" she asked. "No," he said honestly. "I thought you were a child saying what children say. I thought you'd grow up and forget." She smiled at that. "Didn't," she observed. "No," he agreed, "you didn't." The silence stretched between them, not uncomfortable, but heavy with things neither knew how to say. Finally Clara spoke again. "I didn't come back because of that promise," she said. "I came because I needed somewhere safe. Because I remembered this place as somewhere I could breathe. That's all." "I know," Elias said, and meant it. Whatever he'd thought that first day, whatever strange stirring of possibility he'd felt, he knew she was here out of necessity, not nostalgia. Knew that anything else would be unfair to assume. But she continued, then stopped, started again. "But I'm glad it was you. Glad you were still here. I've known a lot of people in 15 years. Good people and bad people, and mostly just tired people trying to survive. And you're still the only one who ever told me the truth, even when it wasn't what I wanted to hear." He felt something tighten in his chest, something that felt like gratitude or grief, or maybe just recognition. "That's what I'm supposed to do," he said. "No," she disagreed. "That's what you choose to do. There's a difference." Before he could respond, they heard it. The sound of horses, multiple horses, coming fast. It was near dark, an unusual time for visitors, and the urgency and the rhythm of hoofbeats suggested something other than a social call. Clara was on her feet instantly, her face pale but composed. "Inside," she said. "Now." They moved quickly into the church. Clara grabbed her saddlebags from her room, the ones that presumably contained the documents she'd stolen. Elias positioned himself near the door. 3 riders were approaching. He could see them now, in the fading light. Armed men, the kind who wore their violence like a second skin. The horses stopped in front of the church. The men dismounted with the casual confidence of people who expected no resistance. Elias stepped outside, placing himself between them and the church. They were strangers to him. Hard men with harder eyes. The kind of men who made their living through intimidation and force. "Help you, gentlemen?" Elias asked. His voice was calm, measured, the tone he used when dealing with difficult situations. The leader, a man with a scarred face and a revolver worn low on his hip, smiled without warmth. "Looking for someone," he said. "A woman. Traveling alone. Might have come through here recently. Red Hollow doesn't get many visitors," Elias replied. "Especially not women traveling alone. This is the end of the earth. People don't come here unless they're lost." The man studied him. "You're the preacher," he stated rather than asked. "I am." "Preachers don't lie," the man said. It was half statement, half threat. "Preachers tell the truth as they understand it," Elias corrected. "And the truth is, I haven't seen what you're looking for." It wasn't technically a lie. He wasn't looking at Clara right now, wasn't seeing her. The logic was thin, but it was enough to keep his conscience clear. The man, however, wasn't convinced. "You won't mind if we look around then," he said, started moving toward the church. Elias stepped into his path. "This is a house of God," he said quietly. "You'll need to respect that." The man's hand moved to his revolver. The message was clear. Elias didn't move, didn't reach for a weapon, he didn't carry one, didn't threaten. Just stood there with the kind of calm certainty that came from believing in something more permanent than violence. For a long moment, nobody moved. The other two men watched their leader, waiting for the signal. Elias kept his eyes locked on the scarred man's face, refusing to show fear, even though his heart was hammering. Finally, the man smiled again, cold and calculating. "We'll be back," he said. "Couple of days, maybe. Give you time to remember if you've seen anything, because lying to protect someone, that's a choice, and choices have consequences." He remounted his horse. The three men rode off, not hurried but not slow either, leaving a trail of dust that hung in the still air like a question mark. Elias waited until they were out of sight before going back inside. Clara was standing behind the altar, tense and ready, holding a knife he hadn't known she carried. When she saw him, her posture relaxed slightly, though her face remained grim. "They'll be back," she said. It wasn't a question. "Yes," he agreed. "They'll check the nearby towns, try to figure out if I was lying. When they don't find anything, they'll come back with more men, more pressure." "You should tell them I'm here," Clara said. Her voice was level, practical. "This isn't your fight. No reason for you to get hurt over my mistakes." "Those weren't mistakes," Elias said firmly. "You saw wrong being done and you tried to stop it. That's not a mistake. That's courage. Courage that might get you killed," she countered. "Maybe," he admitted, "but some things are worth the risk." They stared at each other across the dim interior of the church. Outside, the last light was fading from the sky. Stars were beginning to appear, thousands of them, the kind of sky you only get in places where civilization's light hasn't reached, the kind of sky that makes you feel both infinitely small and mysteriously important. "What are you going to do?" Clara asked. "I'm going to take those documents to the territorial marshal," Elias said. "The one in Silver City, 3 days' ride from here. I'll give a sworn statement, get it on record. Once it's official, once it's out in the open, those men can't just make it disappear. They'll have to deal with legal consequences instead of just hunting you." "That's insane," Clara said. "They'll kill you before you get halfway there." "Maybe," he said again. "Or maybe they'll focus their attention on following me and won't bother looking here. Either way, keeping those documents here puts you in danger, puts this town in danger. Getting them somewhere official is the right thing to do. Since when do you care about the right thing?" she challenged. "You're a preacher in a dying town. You could have left years ago, gone somewhere safe, somewhere that mattered, but you stayed here hiding. Don't pretend this is about righteousness." The words hit harder than she probably intended, or maybe exactly as hard as she intended. Elias felt them land, felt the truth in them, the accusation. She was right. He had been hiding, using the collar as an excuse, using Red Hollow as a shelter from a world he didn't want to engage with, using faith as a shield rather than a sword. "You're right," he said quietly. "I've been hiding. Been running from things I didn't want to face, but maybe," his voice got stronger, "maybe that stops now. Maybe your courage is what I needed to find my own." Clara looked at him for a long moment. Then she reached into her saddlebag and pulled out the documents. Thick papers, official-looking, covered in signatures and stamps and the kind of legal language designed to obscure rather than clarify. She held them out. "If you die," she said, "I'll never forgive you." He took the papers. "If I die," he said with the ghost of a smile, "forgiveness won't be your biggest concern." That night, Elias prepared for the journey, packed light, food, water, the documents wrapped in oilcloth and tied securely. Checked the saddle on the church's one horse, an old gelding named Prophet, who was more stubborn than fast but had endurance. Wrote instructions for the church, though he doubted anyone would care or notice. Said prayers, though he wasn't sure what he was praying for anymore. Clara helped in silence. She didn't try to talk him out of it again, understood, perhaps, that some decisions weren't about logic. They were about becoming the person you needed to be, or at least trying to. Before dawn, Elias mounted up. Clara stood in the doorway of the church, her face unreadable in the pre-dawn darkness. He wanted to say something meaningful, something that would carry weight if these were the last words between them, but everything he thought of sounded false or insufficient. "Be safe," she said finally. "You too," he replied. And then he rode out, into a desert that was still dark, following stars toward a town 3 days away, carrying evidence that might save lives or might just get him killed. Either way, for the first time in 15 years, he felt like he was actually doing something that mattered. The ride was hard. The desert in summer was brutal, even starting before dawn. By the time the sun was fully up, the heat was crushing. Prophet plodded on with the stolid determination of a creature too stupid or too stubborn to quit. They stopped at a waterhole the first night, refilled the canteens, kept moving. Elias saw riders in the distance twice, couldn't tell if they were following or just traveling the same general direction, kept his head down and kept moving. The second day was worse, hotter, the landscape more barren. He saw a rattlesnake coiled in the shade of a rock and gave it wide berth, saw buzzards circling something dead in the distance. The sun beat down with a malevolence that felt biblical, like God testing his resolve. His lips cracked, his skin burned. He kept riding. "Hey, before we finish, I'd love to know where you're tuning in from. Leave a comment telling me your location. It's always amazing to see this community from all over the world. And if you haven't subscribed yet, please do. Your support means everything and helped me continue telling stories that matter." He reached Silver City on the afternoon of the third day, half dead from exhaustion and dehydration and sun exposure. Found the marshal's office. Waited 2 hours because the marshal was dealing with a bar fight. Finally got in to see him, a pragmatic man named Harrison who listened to his story with the expression of someone who'd seen everything and was impressed by nothing. Elias laid out the documents, explained what they showed, gave Clara's name but not her location, said he'd found the documents and understood their significance. Harrison studied them carefully, called in a clerk, had them documented and filed. Told Elias that it would take time to investigate, that powerful men had powerful lawyers, that justice in the territories was more aspiration than reality, but also said that once it was on record, once it was official, it became harder to suppress. It took 2 days for the paperwork to be processed officially. 2 days of waiting in a cheap boarding house, eating food that tasted like grease and regret, wondering if Clara was safe, if those men had returned to Red Hollow, if his absence had put her in more danger rather than less. 2 days of doubt and second-guessing and prayer that felt like talking to an empty room. On the morning he was set to leave, Harrison stopped by the boarding house. "The story's already spreading," he said. "Telegraph office has been busy. Newspapers are picking it up. Those men you're worried about, they're about to have bigger problems than chasing one woman. They're about to have public scrutiny, legal investigations, their own lawyers advising them to lie low. Your friend should be safe." Elias felt something release in his chest. Relief, maybe, or just exhaustion. "Thank you," he said. "Don't thank me," Harrison replied. "Thank whoever had the courage to take those documents in the first place. That took guts." The ride back to Red Hollow took 4 days. He was slower now, exhausted, his body reminding him he wasn't young anymore and hadn't been for a while. But he kept moving, driven by a need to know Clara was all right, to see Red Hollow again, to finish what he'd started. He arrived at sunset on the 4th day, half expecting to find the church burned, or Clara gone, or something terrible that would confirm his worst fears. Instead, he found the church standing as it always had, lights burning inside, smoke rising from the stove. He dismounted slowly, every muscle protesting, and walked to the door. Clara opened it before he knocked. She looked tired but unhurt. When she saw him, something in her face shifted, relief or anger or maybe both. She didn't say anything, just stepped aside to let him in. "I made coffee," she said once the door was closed. "Figured you'd need it." They sat at the small table in his quarters. He told her what had happened, about the marshal, about the paperwork, about the investigation that was starting, about how the story was spreading faster than the men could contain it, about how she was probably safe now, or as safe as anyone could be in a world where powerful men rarely faced real consequences. "You could have died," she said when he finished. Her voice was controlled, but he could hear the emotion underneath. "You could have been killed, and I would have been here not knowing, just waiting, wondering. But I wasn't," he replied, "and now it's done. You're safe. The documents are official. Those families will get their land back. It matters. You matter," she said sharply. "Don't you understand that? Your life matters. You don't get to throw it away just to prove a point." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said softly, "I needed to prove it to myself. Not to anyone else. To myself. That I could still do something that mattered, that I wasn't just a ghost going through motions, that faith meant something beyond words." Clara stood abruptly, walked to the window, stared out at nothing. Her shoulders were tense, her hands clenched. When she spoke again, her voice was raw. "15 years ago, I told you I'd marry you someday," she said. "You told me children's promises don't count. That the world changes people. You were right, I did change. Became someone different, someone harder, someone who learned that the only person you can count on is yourself. But," she turned to face him, "but you didn't change. Not in the ways that matter. You're still the only person I've ever met who actually tries to live what they believe, who risks something for it. And that's terrifying because it means I was right. That 12-year-old girl who didn't know anything about anything, she saw something true. And I don't know what to do with that." Elias stood slowly, crossed the room until he was close enough to see the tears she was fighting. "I'm not who you think I am," he said gently. "I'm flawed and broken, and I've been hiding here for years because I was afraid of the world. Because I failed at things before and couldn't face failing again. You've built me up into something I'm not." "I know exactly who you are," Clara countered. "I'm not a child anymore. I don't have illusions. I see your flaws. I see your fear. I see how you use faith as armor sometimes instead of action. But I also see someone who chooses right even when it's hard, who stands up when it would be easier to look away, who keeps promises even to people who are long gone." She took a breath. That's not illusion, that's truth. The air between them felt charged, heavy with 15 years and unspoken things, and a moment that had been building since she'd ridden back into town. Elias knew he should step back, should maintain the distance that his position required, should remember that he was a preacher, and she was someone under his care, and there were lines that shouldn't be crossed. But he was also tired of hiding. Tired of using duty as an excuse for not living, tired of pretending that faith meant denying human connection, tired of being afraid. "I can't be a preacher, and," he started. "Then don't be a preacher," she interrupted. "Be a man, just a man. That's all I've ever wanted anyway." It wasn't a decision made in that moment. It was a decision that had been building for days, weeks, maybe years. Maybe since the moment she'd said someday, and he'd dismissed it as impossible. A slow accumulation of moments that finally tipped into certainty. He reached out. She took his hand, and in that simple gesture was a promise more binding than any made with words. The next morning, Elias removed his clerical collar. He folded it carefully and placed it on the altar of the church next to the Bible that had been his companion for so many years. He didn't preach a final sermon, didn't make announcements, just left the collar there like an answered question and walked out into the sunlight where Clara was waiting. Red Hollow noticed, of course. The few people who remained noticed everything because there was so little to notice. Some were scandalized. The preacher abandoning his post for a woman? The impropriety, the shame. Others understood or at least accepted it. A few even seemed relieved, like they'd been waiting for him to finally admit he was human. There was no dramatic ceremony, no big wedding. A circuit judge came through 2 weeks later, a man named Patterson, who'd married dozens of couples and barely remembered any of them. He performed the ceremony in the church with 3 witnesses, Dutch from the livery, Mary who'd employed Clara's mother, and a prospector named Henderson who happened to be passing through. The whole thing took maybe 10 minutes, simple words about commitment and choice and the life they were building together. Elias stumbled over his vows. Clara said hers with steady certainty. They were married the same way they'd done everything else, without fanfare, without pretense. Just 2 people making a choice and trusting it was the right one. They built a life in Red Hollow, and that life was not perfect or easy or anything like the fairy tales children grow up hearing. It was work, constant, grinding work. They fixed up the old church building, turned part of it into living quarters. Elias found work as a carpenter, discovered he had a talent for building things that lasted. Clara opened a small school, teaching the handful of children in town and the surrounding ranches, showing them that education was a way out, a way up, a way towards something better. The scandal of their marriage faded the way scandals do when there's no fuel to keep them burning. They were quiet, respectful, hard-working. Eventually, people just accepted them as part of the landscape, as permanent as the mountains. Red Hollow didn't die. Against all odds, it survived. The well was dug deeper and hit better water. New families arrived, drawn by cheap land and rumors of opportunity. A new general store opened. The saloon reopened under new management. Buildings that had been empty were occupied again. It wasn't prosperity exactly, but it was life. Stubborn, persistent life. Years passed. Clara and Elias grew older together, accumulating the small details that make up a shared existence. They had 2 children, a daughter named Margaret after Clara's mother, and a son named David, who had his father's quiet intensity and his mother's sharp intelligence. They had fights and reconciliations. They had moments of joy and periods of struggle. They had the ordinary, extraordinary life of people who choose each other again and again, day after day, until choice becomes so ingrained it's indistinguishable from nature. The story of how they came together became local legend. People new to town would hear it and not quite believe it. A child's promise fulfilled 15 years later. A preacher who gave up his calling for love. A woman who returned to a dying town and brought it back to life through sheer determination? It sounded like fiction, but the proof was there in the two people who lived quiet lives of service and work and occasional joy. Clara lived to be 73. She died in her sleep one winter night, peacefully, after a life lived on her own terms. Elias held her hand as she passed, the same way she'd held her mother's hand all those years ago, and felt the terrible finality of losing someone who'd been part of your life longer than they'd been absent from it. He lived 2 more years without her. Years that felt both endless and impossibly short. He spent them finishing projects they'd started together, making sure the school continued, helping raise grandchildren who bore traces of both their faces. He spent them remembering and being grateful, and sometimes, in quiet moments, talking to her as if she could still hear him. When he died, also peacefully, also at home, the town buried him next to Clara in the cemetery behind the church. Someone carved a marker that said simply, "She knew." He waited. Later, someone else added below that, "They chose." Decades after they were both gone, their story was still told. Parents told children. Grandparents told grandchildren. The details shifted and changed the way stories do, gathering embellishments and losing accuracies. But the core remained, a girl who saw her future and was patient enough to wait for it. A man who learned that faith meant living, not just preaching, a promise that seemed impossible but turned out to be prophecy. The real lesson, though, wasn't about promises or prophecy or even love, at least not the romantic version people like to imagine. It was simpler and harder than that. It was about becoming who you're meant to be, about having the courage to wait for that becoming, about recognizing that transformation takes time and trust and the willingness to be wrong about yourself, about understanding that sometimes the most important thing you can do is see clearly, not the present, but the possibility. Not what is, but what could be if you're willing to work for it. Clara saw that in a church when she was 12 years old. Saw a man who wasn't yet the person he could become, but who carried the potential inside him like a seed. She named that potential, claimed it, waited for it to grow. And Elias eventually became worthy of what she'd seen, not because he was perfect, but because he finally stopped hiding and started living. Their story proved something people in hard places need to believe, that vision matters. That patience is powerful, that some truths are true before we understand them, that the soul sometimes knows things the mind hasn't figured out yet, that growing into your destiny is as important as having one, that love isn't magic, it's choice, made daily, made consciously, made even when it's hard, especially when it's hard. Red Hollow still exists, though it's different now, bigger, more established. There's a paved road and electric lights and other markers of progress. The church where Elias preached is now a community center. The school Clara started is now a proper building with multiple teachers. The town that almost died is alive and thriving in its modest way. But people still talk about the preacher and the girl who promised to marry him, still point out their graves on the hillside. Still tell the story with a kind of reverence, usually reserved for saints or heroes, though neither Elias nor Clara would have claimed to be either. They were just people, flawed, complicated, ordinary people who made extraordinary choices, who waited for each other even when waiting seemed foolish, who saw truth even when truth wasn't obvious, who built something lasting out of patience and faith and the stubborn insistence that some things matter enough to fight for. "Someday, I'll be your wife," she said. 13 years later, she made it true. Not through magic, not through destiny in the sense of fate, of things that must happen because they're written, but through choice, through seeing clearly, through patience and transformation and the courage to become the people who could make that childhood promise into adult truth. And that, more than any fairy tale or romantic legend, is what makes their story matter. It's not about prediction, it's about commitment. Not to a future you can see, but to the person you're becoming, and the trust that someone else is becoming too, and that maybe, if you're both patient and lucky and brave, you'll meet each other at the right moment, in the right place, as the right versions of yourselves. That's what happened in Red Hollow. That's what the graves on the hillside represent. Not a miracle. Not destiny. Just two people who chose each other across time and distance and doubt, who waited until they were ready, who recognized each other not as they were but as they could be, and who spent their lives proving that recognition wasn't illusion, but insight. Some promises are meant to be kept, not because they're promises, but because they're visions. And visions, if you're willing to work for them, if you're patient enough to wait for them, if you're brave enough to grow into them, have a way of becoming real. That's the story of Elias Crow and Clara Mayfield. That's why people still talk about them. That's why their names are still spoken with something like awe in a town that's mostly forgotten everyone else who lived and died there. Because they proved that sometimes a child's certainty is wiser than adult cynicism. That sometimes waiting is the most active thing you can do. That sometimes the longest journey is the one from who you are to who you're meant to be. And that sometimes, if you're very fortunate, you find someone willing to take that journey with you, someone who saw the destination before you did, someone who waited for you to see it too. Someday, she said, and someday came. Not when they expected, not in the way they imagined, but it came. And it was worth every moment of waiting.